There's a few different theories out there, as with all psychology. It's all theory-based. But the way that I talk, the research that I've done, the way that I talk about it with the ladies that I mentor, is it's important to recognise that it starts very, very young. And it's actually something that's happening right at the beginning of the formation of the limbic system, when our priority as a child is to be fed, is to be dry and safe and warm and loved. And those three things, the safety, the stomach being full, and the sense of love, are our three main priorities at that time. And at some point during that, around a year to 18 months, maybe a little bit older, something is going on with regards to the relationship with the people that the child is being cared for by, in as so much as something is happening where that love is being misconstrued, or it's being left out, or the needs aren't being met in some way. And it skews the impression of attachment and connection with other human beings for that child. And it's not all lost at that point if that happens. I think that's an important thing to recognise, is that there are various points as we develop as children into adulthood whereby we can kind of retread the neural pathways, or we can kind of reverse out and start again. But if children are not experiencing a healthy model of empathy, of modesty, because we know that grandiosity is a very kind of key character trait or personality trait of the narcissist. If there isn't a model of modesty, then we're going to see grandiosity. And if there isn't a model of empathy, we're going to see some very selfish, self-centered behaviors out of the child. And as they develop, they're also going to you'll find that as this child is developing, they're trying out, like all children, different behaviors, and then they're getting feedback off those behaviors. And if the behaviors that they're displaying get the right feedback, if it serves them in some way and they get the result they're after, then actually the morality, whether the behavior is right or wrong, if that's not being modeled by a parent in a way that is, demonstrating good moral behavior, fairness, empathy, equality, then we're going to find that we've got somebody who's very self-centered, lacks the ability to put themselves into somebody else's shoes, and feeds off power and control. And there we have a narcissist. Very much. It's very much how, when it comes down to it, we end up describing these people as being big, spoiled kids. Yeah. Many big-bodied kids there. So lots. And in all walks of life, across all socioeconomic statuses, across all races, everywhere this is happening. It is not something that is to one class, to one it's completely across the board. And it is scary, really on the ground, it's happening more than anybody would care to really recognise. Children push boundaries. It's how we learn. It's a really healthy way to learn to push boundaries. But if parents aren't themselves modeling positive behavior that is founded on those core values, that love, that compassion, that empathy, that kindness, then the child is going to maybe be successful in pushing boundaries. And often children will push if a child is being brought up with those that core values at the heart of the parenting, a child might well push the boundaries, one that isn't will push the boundaries of one that is, and find that they can manipulate behavior, for example, to get a result, sense of putting themselves in the other child's shoes in that moment, they may well find, well, this works. And it could be very innocent, childlike behavior, you know, that, like I say, they push boundaries, but the more it works, the more it reinforces, the more it makes up their go-to strategies to deal with problems, really, because we're all out there solving problems all the time. Definitely, children are looking for a model at all times, a role model. Modelled behaviour is something that we can see, and we can see how when a child gets in front of a positive role model, how quickly a child can turn a corner, can change their behaviour. And this is, like I say, this happens right into teenage years and young adulthood. You know, often people, once they are presented with a positive role model who in some way speaks to them on a level that they can connect with, we can see massive changes in people's personality and the development of their personality, because ultimately any sort of personality disorder is actually a personality development disorder. And at some point, the development is arrested and it stops. And this is why we're talking about these big body babies that are walking around, is because at some point in their development, everything stopped and they are repeating what went on at that time to stop that development, almost in a sense to try and resolve it. You know, as humans, we often will find that we repeat our traumas. We try and recreate anything that's confusing to us, anything that we haven't been able to resolve. We'll often find ourselves recreating the circumstances around it subconsciously, more often than not, but we'll find until we can reach a resolution. And I see this with my own toddler. You know, when she's trying to resolve something, she's recreating the situation to try and get to the next stage, to get the feedback and then develop further. And that's exactly what's happening with the personality. And we'll often find absolutely people that haven't got a personality developmental disorder will also repeat things or find themselves in similar situations. I know that I certainly did. I went from one relationship, abusive relationship, straight into another because I was trying to resolve whatever it was that was going on there and the emotions that I'd experienced. Once we start to gather more and more data, depending on what kind of person we are, as we're starting to experience more, where we can draw comparisons, we can draw differences. If we are pragmatic in our approach, if we are able to adopt a perspective where we can come out of our situation and look on it with some sort of, from a different angle, often we'll find that there's something that needs resolving. Right. That's something a narcissist cannot do. They can't adopt that alternative perspective. And that's why when people ask, can they be helped? Can this be, you know, cured? Can they develop further? Actually, that's why it's so difficult, because you've got to get them to be able to have a level of self-awareness, which is very difficult to teach in an adult. Exactly. And what's really interesting to me about the narcissistic, sociopathic, psychopathic personality types is that they are unable, because of the lack of empathy, because of their inability to put themselves into another person's shoes, they have a model of the world whereby everybody is thinking like them. No, they've got a sense of grandiosity, so they already put themselves as though the way that they think, operate, and are is optimum, is better than most people, and that they can't put up themselves in our situation. They can't imagine or adopt kind of a perspective whereby our own experiences, so me as a woman would have a different experience to a man, who as a black man would have a different experience. Different part of the world, there's so much. Exactly. Right. They wouldn't be able to do that. No, so all they are doing is modeling in, projecting in their impression of the world into us. And so everything that they believe, we have to believe as well, or we have to adopt those personality traits. absolutely we're the problem in their eyes, especially.
That's crazy, right?
It's absolutely crazy. It's certifiably crazy. It's it's sectionably crazy as well. If you really go criminal with it, it is absolutely crazy. Absolutely, and even the giving in, to some extent, you can never give in enough, and so you can never give enough. Wow. So whilst you could commit a lot, and there are plenty of people out there that do commit their life to feeding this monster essentially and feeding the supply, and they do, sadly, the relationship ends when they die, and that is a very, very sad, just a sad fact that me as someone who works in this field and campaigns in this field wants to ensure that children are being educated about healthy relationships, so that's not happening. But the reality is, generationally, if we look back, then absolutely there are lots of people that have never made it out of these relationships. The result, the loss of the identity, the loss of self, the loss of self-worth, that is the result of somebody feeding off all of your good traits, really. And it does sort of bring us back to this trauma bond thing, is that often they rationalize this relationship by defining what they are experiencing as love, and they almost change their definition of love to fit the trauma bond. And really, when we talk about why the narcissist forms, why the trauma bond forms, it's because that's what the narcissist experienced. When we go right back to that lack of, at some point the needs not being met, what was happening there was a trauma bond, because it wasn't kind, compassionate, understanding, forgiving love. It was in some way based on control or on an inability to get what they needed, and therefore they will externalize their experience and they'll wrap that up as love, because the truth is too painful. The truth that your main caregiver hates you is too painful to actually process, especially at such a young age. Absolutely. And, it's that sense of false reality that you can then see play out in the materialistic nature of the narcissist, in that obsession about how things look to the outside world. Absolutely. And that's where you might see more overt narcissists that aren't necessarily malignant in the way that they operate in their lives. So there are a lot of narcissists that aren't what we'd consider to be abusive, because actually they are not abusive because the shame of being labelled an abuser would then not fit with the sense of grandiosity. So that almost prevents them from being abusive. However, we have got a lot of malignant and covert narcissists whereby the damage is being done inside the relationship. They have to self-reflect, and it isn't possible. It just isn't possible for them to be able to look inward. And, part of that is almost a survival mechanism, because I know from my own personal experience, the kind of rationale or the way that you approach it is, well, if you're going to behave like that and it gets the result that you want, because I know that I'm complying on the basis of your behavior, because I can feel myself doing it, well, I'm going to try and see if you comply on the basis of my behavior. And when they don't, that's often when the alarm bells might start to go off and the realization starts to happen. But often that is once we have reacted back in some way. And for some people, if the campaign of fear is so vehement and so present, and the physical and emotional threat is one that is just so threatening, then maybe we will never react back, because the fear of what could happen next is too much. And that's completely understandable. Yeah, absolutely. There were a set of circumstances. There wasn't one particular event that made me realise that he had these traits. There was a particular event that made me escape And that did happen one day. But actually the build up to understanding what was going on in the relationship, I think for so many people, it was a culmination of factors, behaviours, information that came in. You know, some of it, I think everybody I speak to often will say that they don't really know how they found out about narcissism, but it just sort of happened one day. Somebody mentioned it, they came across it on, for me, I came across it on a blog post, and I was just, you know, was drawn to find out more.
Okay, all right.
For a long time in our relationship, I thought I was the problem. I'd come out of an abusive relationship. I had been in a business where I was very busy. I had given over a lot of my time and energy to the business. It was a hospitality business, so it was very long hours. It was very intensive. And this man swooped in, and he played the role as my knight in shining armor. He would protect me. He would never treat me like my husband. He would support me. You know, and I was exhausted physically working, and he was being that kind of comforting and caregiving role that I needed at the time. And that's when the trauma bond was forming, because that's what I needed him to be, and that's what he was being. The fact that wasn't his real personality, that it wasn't his real who he was, only comes apparent later on. By that time, you know, my mental health is kind of blamed. My previous relationship is blamed. So any sort of reaction or response to his behavior, me thinking it wasn't healthy, that we weren't communicating, wasn't expressing, nothing was ever good enough, you know, any of that all went back to, well, this is because you were abused in your marriage. And it took a long time for me to then start to think, well, actually, I did a lot of work on healing myself in the relationship when it came to those sorts of, when it came to the previous relationship. And it was only once I started to do that, and his behavior didn't change. The promises were made, nothing was kept. It became very apparent how cyclical the behavior was, even to the point where I took responsibility for the cycle at one point, because it was blamed that it was tied in with my menstrual cycle.
Wait. You took blame for the cycle of his moodiness, essentially, and technically his abusive behavior.
Absolutely, because he projected so much of it onto me. Exactly that. And because I suppose the menstrual cycle ties in, you know, in terms of even the time span, you know, it's a week long where the PMS stuff is happening. And then you've got, you know, it just sort of feeds, or it suits the narrative to them.
It suits the narrative.
You know, the reality is that, as we were describing earlier, because they externalize all of the fault of the world being with everybody else in the world and none of it being with them, they will believe that is what the problem is. You know, there was an incident. We actually had to live with my parents for a little while. We moved to Spain for nearly a year in the relationship, and when we came back, we couldn't tie up getting, you know, accommodation straight off the bat. So we stayed at my parents for a while. And the tension that he created around my interactions with my family, you know, if anything that I spoke about was inappropriate, I shouldn't have said it. I shouldn't have said it like that. I shouldn't have, you know, it's none of their business. And, you know, obviously things that anyone would talk about with their family, nothing of any sort of, that you would even think
you're being human. Yeah, you would even think it's just family. We're just talking.
And again, it's interesting because if you think back to the way that their relationship with family formed, well, though they wouldn't have those conversations with family, because especially if they're the scapegoat member of it, you know, the way that the narcissistic family is created or is quite interesting in itself. But, you know, there are a couple of roles that happen within a narcissistic family dynamic, and there's a scapegoat often and a golden child, and he was definitely the scapegoat character. So to him, having a healthy connection with your parents was something that was just so alien. So for me to talk about our day, our business, our normal goings on, the kids, what was going on with my eldest at the time. My youngest wasn't around, but that was all re-wrapped up to be problematic, despite the fact that I know now, and anybody looking on would know that
it's not a problem.
Run-of-the-mill conversations.
From your perspective now, looking back, I'm just curious that he needed to cause havoc. He needed to, as you said, tensions were created. Did it seem like that was his intent wherever he went, to create tension, even if he was going out to eat?
Oh my goodness. Going out to eat was one of the most always, whenever we went out to eat, he always found a problem. And I just mentioned that I was in hospitality when we met, and so I lived and ran a restaurant. And he actually and I didn't pick up on it at the time. I was very much in the love bombing stage, but at one point he complained to me about the meal that was served in my restaurant that he was eating for free.
And he had a problem.
Go and speak to the chef and explain what had been wrong on the meal, and then me report back with the resolution. Humans often we often repress memories, and I repressed that one until I was way out of the woods and healthy and healed. But isn't it just crazy? I love that it's ready for that new happy memory to come in, because so many women that I work with, and I do work with women, I'm sure men that do experience the same, but for me, I can only report on what I know, what I work on. But for so many women that I work with, they are so fearful when these memories come in. They are so kind of concerned, or it raises alarm, when they have those memories, because they feel like they're never going to escape them. And often the sign of a trauma bond is, having these obsessive thoughts. But actually, when the subconscious will not present something to you that it doesn't believe that you have the tools to resolve. And I find that to be a really comforting thing, because I know that when these things come up or have come up, that somewhere in me there's a belief that I can resolve this. And the more that you do resolve, the more that you do allow yourself to experience those memories, those emotions in a safe space and in a safe way, then, like you say, you open up space for the positive, the good, for the wisdom to start to come out of these experiences. Curiosity around these things, and why, for me, I find I'm curious. I'm curious as to why these things come up when they do. I'm curious as to when I resolve it, what's going to come in next. And that was a big mindset shift for me that happened, that made me not fear healing and resolving this stuff, but having that belief that that I have all the tools that I need. And you're no different than if I have a massive physical trauma, God forbid, that wouldn't happen, but I would know that my body has everything it needs to heal it. I don't worry about a scab forming when I cut my arm. And that's the same thing with emotional healing, is because the thoughts are so painful, and because we often feel like we are our thoughts, we find it difficult to trust that actually the thoughts can come in, they can move away, they can come back again, they can go again. And we can resolve them, and we can learn from them, we can convert them into wisdom and learn more about ourselves, and that scab will turn into a scar.
Thank you very much. We'll see you later. Thank you for doing this. We'll talk again.
You're welcome. See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Network.